Hello, and welcome to my show. Today you get me. I'm here to talk Q&A, and it's been a few months. I try to do one Q&A episode a month so that we can just talk about course updates, if there are any, which we'll talk about today because I've got some news, and just talk about what you're doing, what you're learning. Hopefully it's one of them is my courses, like you can find below. So if you've not been in one of these Q&As, it's an entire hour or more, depending on how many questions you have, of just talking about containers and DevOps. That's the focus of my channel. That's the focus of my courses, is how can we do everything DevOps with containers? And in fact, I've just got a new Apple M1. I got the M1 Pro 14-inch. And so my month has been learning all about using ARM as your number one platform, essentially, and doing all the things in ARM. And that's been a big topic this year for me in my courses, because we've done a lot of overhaul and updating all of the applications, including sometimes custom building normal applications just so they'll work on ARM, specifically ARM64, but ideally also Raspberry Pi ARM7, which is 32-bit. Anyway, we're going to get into all of that. But if you haven't been here before, thank you so much for showing up. This show is about you. And I try to do them once a month, but we haven't had one of these Q&As in months. This might be the last one of the year because I have guests coming up. Actually, let's see. Next week in America is Thanksgiving, so we will not be doing a live show on Thanksgiving because it would be me shoving food in my mouth all day and sitting on the couch. So we don't want to watch that. And by the way, next week is also my 20th wedding anniversary with my lovely wife, and one of her presents to me is this new wall hanging of Stormtrooper Legos men. I don't know if you can actually see that or not, but they're actually this big, and they use what are those cameras called? The special lenses that you can get super zoomed in, and so it's like salt and little tiny figurines taking pictures of little tiny Stormtroopers. Anyway, I'm a Star Wars guy, also Marvel guy. So today we're going to just drill down, and I can do demos. I've got everything ready. I've got my terminal up. I've got my project stuff up. We can talk about that. But thank you to you patrons that support this show. This is technically about my Udemy courses today, but if you didn't know, I also have a Patreon page. And that is, you don't have to spend any money. Basically, it's the best way to get updates on all my guests, all my open source repos, which I'm due for a major update to you on some of the things that have been created this year. And there's been a lot. I've had multiple, maybe 3 or 4 new repo examples of all sorts of things. And you can just do that by clicking the follow button here, and then you'll get like an email a week from me. So you can do that. If you'd like to buy me a coffee, you can get exclusive benefits, including our High Fivers group. We're going to be making some changes to that to enhance the new enhance High Fivers, and I'm going to talk about that in the future. But basically, if you didn't know, we have a Discord server, 7,000 people, all talking about DevOps. Thank you so much for being a part of that community. I'm excited to see it grow. And for those of you supporting it with not just your money, but your time, helping others in there, I really appreciate that. That is a big deal to me, and you deserve some applause and maybe some celebration noises. So you can, by the way, with the High Fivers group, you get access to a monthly call. We're going to also make some changes to that. That monthly call is now going to also be an opportunity for anyone to bring any files they want to review. So infrastructure as code, Docker files, not necessarily development stuff unless it relates specifically to DevOps. It's not, this isn't a purely code focused channel, but we deal with code all day. So bring that stuff. That's once a month with the High Fivers group, and that's in our Discord server. And you would get an invite to that Hangout. We basically it's like a video call. We do a Discord audio video channel, and we all just talk about the project. So that next one is coming up. We just had one, so we're having another one in December. And if you're interested in that, go check out patreon.com/Bret Fisher. All right. So enough about that. Also, remember the podcast is back live, or back shipping. We're shipping podcast episodes again. So you can also find that over, let's see, bretfisher.com/podcast. And we usually get an episode every week out, and it comes from this show. So what we do is we trim it down. We spend hours on each episode trimming it down to just the essentials. We don't leave in all like the demos and the things that don't make sense in an audio only format. And then we only take the best episodes from that. So not every episode of this live show turns into a podcast, but just the best ones that I like. So we do that, and you should check it out. Someone the other week said they were listening to it while running. I'm not sure that's the most motivational music you could be playing while you're exercising, but hey, sometimes we like to learn while we're working out. Maybe I need some theme music in the background for those that want to pump some iron or run around while they're listening to DevOps talking. Anyway, all right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for showing up. Nebraska. It's been a while when someone's shown up from Nebraska. North California. Hello, hello. Raju, Beth, Quentin, Caesar, Jesse, Cole, Kamarju. Still struggling with that name, but I'm doing my best. Payam Abdullah Reinshard, Martin, Peter, Paul. Paul was the first one in here today. Andre, hello, Anton. What's up, everyone? All right, so thank you, by the way, Jesse, finishing your courses, want to get a Docker cert. So that's a great question to start off with, certifications. So, in fact, I'm gonna make that a little bigger. I'm gonna make how can I make that bigger? Ooh, that's too big. Now we gotta make it smaller. All right, I'll worry about that later. Certifications. So I wouldn't recommend the Docker Start anymore. I really wouldn't. Unless you're someone who has zero experience and you're just trying to get your first job, in which case, get all the certifications. Because if you don't have experience, like certifications are one of the few ways you can use to prove yourself. The other big way to prove yourself, by the way, is make a GitHub profile and do stuff. Like make repos, right? Your GitHub doesn't have to have whatever 50 to 100 repos like mine does, but you need to have stuff there. You need to be doing things in the open to show off your skills. This is one of the few jobs out there, development, operations, specifically DevOps here, that you can just display your work for everyone to see on the internet and show what you can do. If you don't have a profile or it's empty, no one's going to know. It's basically a part of your resume now, right? We all go to LinkedIn to look at your history, but now what you can do is GitHub. So definitely do that if you're looking to improve your resume. When it comes to certifications, I think Docker's is no longer actually maintained by Docker. Docker Certified Associate is now maintained by Mirantis, which is weird that it's still called Docker Certification because it has nothing to do with Docker, the company. And Mirantis runs it, but it's most of it now is involved with their Kubernetes and Swarm platform, which there are some Docker stuff in there, but there is no open source Docker test. There is Docker sprinkled maybe in other tests. So I would now focus on three main areas. If you're trying to get into DevOps or if you're trying to beef up your resume, focus on a Linux certification, a cloud certification, just one of each, right? And then once you have those to show the fundamentals, then and maybe a Network Plus, right? So that you show that you know networking, because you're going to need those skills anyway. You can look at something like the Kubernetes certifications, right? And once you have one Kubernetes certification, you don't necessarily need to go deep with the rest of them because there's at least three now. And I wouldn't recommend doing all three unless you wanted your job to be just running Kubernetes servers. If you are wanting to be a little bit more broad, then I would go and maybe look at DevOps certifications. Like I think do Azure and AWS both have DevOps certifications? Maybe. So you're going to go down that route. And you're going to want to show that you have these pillars: the operating system with Linux, the networking, the Kubernetes, because that's one of the few popular tool certifications, and then cloud certifications, because you can look at things like Terraform and other tools, but I think nowadays really the operating system and the clouds are the two, I think, fundamentals that often will get people coming into DevOps, but they don't understand how to troubleshoot TCP routing problems, but they have a Kubernetes certification. So they're okay at Kubernetes commands, but if anything breaks, they have a hard problem troubleshooting because they don't really know networking or the OS. So I recommend that. Great question, though. Thanks, Jesse. All right, so let's get some questions in. Why are you here? What do you need answered today? I'm working now with my team to finally, we're back to major efforts on course updates. I know I've been talking about them all year. I had lots of other distractions, including client projects, personal projects, and we are now back. We got a new editor. We actually are bringing on a second editor, and then possibly even a third editor that we've already identified to edit videos, so that once I start recording, we've got stuff happening in open source over there. If you actually went to bret.show/changelog, let's see, that's bret.show/changelog. That will take you to the new beta feature in GitHub, which is the new projects interface. It's pretty sweet. So over here, you can now actually see it in Kanban view and in list view, and they're going to be adding other views as well here in the future, I hear. So that's kind of neat. So we're trying to do all course updates, all course bugs, what's coming in the future of the courses. We're going to be trying to do that more in open source. In the past, it's been a little bit of a black box. You've had to ask me, hey, what's happening? What's next? What are you doing? And I kind of want to get that out there. We're already doing all this stuff in GitHub anyway, except for the videos themselves, which obviously are on Udemy. So it's not just me working here. This is actually, if you've been in my courses, you've seen Ivor, the TA. He's helping me with that as well. And so we're working on this, and he's actually working on a new section with advanced Dockerfile stuff. So you can see over in our in progress section, we have Dockerfile next steps. That's being worked on. I'm working on some new videos at the beginning of the courses to make them better. And if you're interested in following those updates, you can check out the changelog. So that's an experiment. We're basically moving everything out of our internal systems that keeps track of bugs, fixes that we need to have because of deprecations or changing in versions. There's lots. We have hundreds now of combinations of bug fixes, things that we want to update because they're just old, like the install videos. They're a little bit outdated. And then anything that is a new idea for new stuff in all 4 of my courses, including new courses, that's all going to start going in there. And looking to get a little bit of community involvement for those that want to be involved or want to know what's going on. So go check that out. And that's my big update on the courses. We don't have a new section yet, but I expect for us to have one soon. And as you've heard me say here in the past, soon is whenever it gets finished. So, but we're actively working on that almost every day now. And you should see more updates in the courses from us coming soon. All right. Why did I rename my Udemy Docker course DevOps? I didn't. I did not rename the courses. It's still called Docker Mastery. If that's the question you were asking, R&R. Name some new technologies evolving should look after Kubernetes for future upgrading career. Well, I think if you're already doing Kubernetes, right, then do more of that. I don't know necessarily, because if a shop is already doing Kubernetes, you're already, a leading company, right? Because my primary consulting gig is to help companies adopt Docker and Kubernetes, and there's a lot of them that still don't have that. So if you're already doing Kubernetes, then I would say go further down that path. So look at the things that typically follow on when people start implementing Kubernetes. They need usually better monitoring and metrics. So really understanding observability, what that means, and diving into things like Prometheus, Loki, some of these new tools, and not just learning the tools to how to install it, but actually looking and even providing your own examples in open source so that your job, your future jobs, can take advantage of you just being able to implement those things, having your own templates of how to install them. I think that's really important. I'm not always a fan of running your own logging and monitoring solutions. If you have the money, I often recommend teams buy versus build in that department because those tools can get really complicated and it can end up being a lot of work to maintain them yourself. We're all busy, so maybe consider outsourcing it. But if you don't have the money to outsource, or if you're given the mandate that you can't outsource, then I would focus on, right now, the big buzz for logging is around Loki, and then of course the buzz around monitoring is Prometheus. So I would learn those. GitOps, understanding one of the GitOps tools at least, like Argo CD, probably the most popular GitOps tool like right now. Argo CD, and then maybe Crossplane, which is maybe a future tool for infrastructure automation on top of Kubernetes. We've talked about that this year. Crossplane, if you just look up crossplane.io, I think is the name of that app. And maybe if you're into development languages as a DevOps language, maybe Pulumi, although I go back and forth on Pulumi. That's pretty bleeding edge stuff that I don't see teams in mass yet adopting. It's not a huge deal. So I think that's a little on the edge of what I would recommend. I think really focusing on understanding more of the Kubernetes distributions and how to implement, a series of example apps, let's say you have, and how to implement those in EKS, how to implement that in EKS with Fargate and what the limitations are, how to implement that on Google Cloud, on Azure. I think a DevOps professional who's not going to be at the same company forever, ideally needs to start branching out their clouds because, as AWS is the number one by far, we are seeing people moving from AWS to other clouds, moving to Azure, moving to Google. I don't have recommendations on why you need to do that. Everyone has their own organizational issues and stuff. But I think that branching out from one cloud and then maybe branching out from one type of automation tool. So if you've known Jenkins in the past, go learn GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions is my number one automation platform now. It's the first one I would teach people. Someday I'll hopefully have a course on it. And once you've learned that, try to apply some of those basic lessons to something like Circle CI, which is extremely popular. I'm not a fan of Jenkins, but it's everywhere. So it's kind of expected now that you at least know the basics of Jenkins, even though I really wish no one would ever use it again. And then try GitLab, right? Understand how to deploy GitLab because that is also a common platform. I personally love GitHub. I always use GitHub. I use Codespaces and Copilot and all these new things that they have, which I think are wonderful. But I know not everyone uses that. And probably the next tool I see people using when they're not using GitHub is GitLab, especially for DevOps teams. I mean, Bitbucket is obviously a thing, but I really see that as a very small subsection of the community. And to me, Bitbucket is very similar to GitHub. So I think GitLab is the other one that I think really it would be useful for your career to know how to implement and the pros and cons of using that versus GitHub. That's a good one. That's a great question. I could talk about that all day. So I'll move on to some other questions. All right. Here's a technical question. We're getting deep. Windows using multipass to run Ubuntu VMs. Cool. Multipass is great if you haven't heard about it. It's basically my replacement for Docker machine. Multipass allows you to spin up Ubuntu machines really quickly on your local box, various versions. It takes not even a minute to spin up a new one. It's fully installed, so no more manually creating a Linux VM, right? Multipass is the fix for that, and it works on Windows, Mac, and Linux. All right, I was able to join the nodes to the master all already. I exposed the service of a deploy with Nginx image, but I can't access from the host. Let's see. I have not seen that issue. That's going to be more related to multipass and ports on multipass. So when you say you can't access it from the host, can you access any of the ports from the host? Can you access a port if you just run something natively on the OS? Because I'm assuming this isn't a Docker issue. I'm assuming this is related to the machine itself, right? The multipass machine. So obviously I don't have the fix for you, but I would start looking at the Linux VM itself and making sure those ports are open and that you can access them from the proper IP address. And then so start from the basics, right? Do that, then try Docker. So, install Nginx or run Apache, or whatever on the machine natively on that way you can rule out Docker networking, Docker port publishing, and all that stuff, and just run something on that. And then once you know that works, and you've figured all that stuff out with multipass, then make sure that Docker works, right? And then if you were going to do Kubernetes in there, then I would layer Kubernetes on top of that, right? Because that's another type of tool that does different IP tables work, and both of those, Docker and Kubernetes will muck with the IP tables, and if you turn on a firewall, that will also be a problem inside the Linux VM for your ports. But there's no firewall on, I believe, by default, right? So in those Linux VMs for multipass, you should be able to just access the ports via the IP, not localhost, because localhost doesn't work with multipass. They get their own IP address, each one of those machines. Hopefully that helps. Good luck. Docker ps-a, Docker ps-a, it's showing container, but Docker ps, it's not showing. But app service shows instance running. How do we check? Okay, so if you see it running, if with -a, and if you don't see it in Docker ps, it's not running. I mean, I've never seen a case where that's not true. If Docker ps doesn't show it, that's only showing running containers. A container can be stopped. So when you do a ps-a, you see stopped containers as well. And so you can do a Docker inspect and the container name, and then you can see all the status. Like if it shut down, what was the error code? Was there a logging error message? Do Docker logs to see what logs are in that message. If you are, a lot of times what I see with people, if they say the web server or the thing looks like it's running, often that's because of browser caching. And so whenever you're doing testing to see whether something is actually working, do it from the command line. Do a curl against that website, assuming it's a web app. Because often browsers will cache, especially Chrome can be a little funky around if the server's down, it just shows you the last page. So it might not be obvious that it's actually broken or it's actually not running. And I've never seen any consistency with the Docker ps command in terms of what's running and what's not running. So, all right. What do you think of the new M1s? I think everybody who loves Mac, who has a Mac, is going to be on one in the next year because they're insisting that we get off Intel, and I have no bad news. Like everything runs amazing. It's super quiet. I never hear fans. It's super fast, and I'm sitting here on the 14-inch Pro version, nothing crazy, and I'm running all this streaming stuff. I'm running Docker in the background, and it's barely even working. So I love them. It's great. There are minor issues around the waiting for apps to be updated, but Docker can run Intel apps automatically inside of Docker on these M1 ARMs, right? So I can still run most apps, maybe not things like MySQL, because that's MySQL specifically. You can just use Maria, which is a database of MySQL is compatible with MySQL, but MySQL doesn't run well in the QEMU emulation, if you get into that. Anyway, that's kind of diving deep into that. The whole point is, yes, it works. All my things run. All my containers run. It's great. And for things that maybe don't run and I want to run them natively, I'm using code service or code spaces, right? We've all talked about code spaces multiple times this year. I love GitHub code spaces. And I've been using it more and more so that I can develop on my iPad and I can develop at my desk and I can use any machine and all of my code stays on the server in the cloud. I can, I get 4 CPUs and 8 gigs of RAM on an Intel machine. So I love it. It's great. How do you build and test images for M1 without having an M1 machine? Is it possible? Yes. There are multiple ways to do this. If you go back in the previous episodes earlier this year, at the beginning of this year, there was 2 different episodes. One of those is actually coming out as a podcast here in the next month, but I have multiple episodes on M1. So go back in the logs, you're watching this on YouTube. So go back in my videos to the beginning of 2021. I had at least 2 shows entirely on Apple M1 and Docker. I have example repos, including, in here I have I have a multi-platform Docker build notes. So one of my goals is when I create a Docker file that it works on as many platforms as possible. Ideally, I don't want a Docker file that only works on Intel, right? Because the world is changing very quickly. We have Graviton instances in AWS. We already have people talking about, the future of server architecture may be ARM and RISC instead of Intel. So we are now in a multi-platform world. And everything ideally is built at least on Intel x86 64 compatible, and also called AMD 64, depending on how you're building it, and then on ARM 64, and also ideally ARM v7, which is 32-bit. And this repo, I'll just throw this in chat, that this repo has a bunch of notes that I took on how to make that image work. Specifically, and there's an example here, I believe. Specifically, you need to be able to, when you pull in other binaries, you need to be able to do that stuff. You need to be able to pull in binaries based on the platform you're building on. So there is this, and another one that you should look at is an actual working real-world example is my SH pod. So let's see. Let me see if I can find this one. I always forget the name of my repos. All right. So in here's a working example of this in action. This is a really big Docker file, but this Docker file works on at least 3 different architecture platforms, right? It works on x86 64, it works on ARM 64, and works on ARM v7. So it does a bunch of effort in making sure that it gets the right binaries when it downloads them. And if you look in this GitHub, you can actually see in my workflows directory, this is how I build it. So in this repo, you can see down here, I use BuildX, and I use BuildX to build across 3 platforms in parallel, and it will use QEMU to build those on an Intel machine. So QEMU will use the emulation to build on ARM 64 and ARM v7. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to get Graviton instances in AWS and build there natively on a pure, real ARM piece of hardware. Graviton instances are actually pretty cheap. They're, I think, 40% the cost of Intel. So you can check those out. You can add those to your Jenkins, your GitHub Actions, whatever you want to do. But here, what I'm doing is I'm using QEMU, and you can scroll up and see how I do that. I have a bunch of comments here on setting up QEMU the Docker way, and then setting up BuildX to be able to support that and do multi-platform building all in parallel, all on the same machine. All right. So that's how I do it in the cloud. When I'm running it locally, Docker just does QEMU for me. I just need to specify that in the command line. If you've ever dealt with these multi-platforms at the command line, you know that you have the Docker, you can do Docker build platform, you can do Docker run platform, and when you specify it there, you can say, for an example, in my case, I want to run on Linux, for example, Docker run, well, just to prove my point, Docker info. So, here we go. So the architecture I'm on right now is AArch64. That is ARM. So proving I'm on an M1, okay? If I want to run an Intel-based container on top of this using QEMU automatically, again, these are all from early in the year episodes, but just a quick review. I can do a Docker run -- platform Linux / AMD 64. That's one of the ways you can specify that platform. And then I can say here, Alpine. And then I'm just going to run a shell. So if I do that, it's going to pull the image from the manifest for AMD 64. And then if I run it again without that statement, what you'll see is it's interesting. This is something that I talked about at the beginning of the year, but just to finish this little statement up, this is an interesting dilemma because what happened was in the background, it pulled down the AMD 64 image.
But when you do a Docker image ls, you see a list of images, and you don't see the architecture yet. So I've gotten a lot of feedback. I've gone to Docker and given them feedback that says, hey, add the platform as a column so we can see the platform in the image list. Because what I just did was I did a Docker run, but it decided to run the image I already have. So the image I have in the cache isn't an ARM image, it's an Intel image. So it just warns me, hey, I'm running an image that's a different architecture than the one on your host. It's not a native architecture, but I know how to run it, so I'm going to run it for you anyway. So that's just the warning it's given me, and I'm now running that image, that Intel image on my ARM machine. You can do the opposite on your Intel machine. You can just specify the different platform and say Linux/ARM64, and you can run ARM images all day long on your Intel or AMD machines. All right? Hopefully that helps. Let's see what questions I missed. Oh boy. Got a bunch of good questions. Do you notice a huge demand for DevOps? Why does it happen now? Yes. I mean, obviously, there's tons of channels now on YouTube with hundreds of thousands of followers and subscribers and millions of views, all just on DevOps content. So clearly, DevOps. And DevOps is just the next thing in the evolution of how developers get their code to production, and that whole pipeline and the whole feedback loop of we get things to production, we then operate and evaluate, and then we make improvements, and that whole cycle. That's why the DevOps is an infinity, because it's kind of this never-ending cycle of improvement. And so DevOps really isn't drastically new. It's just a combination of us learning about the cloud and how to do distributed computing, and then the whole lean manufacturing movement and the agile movements, they all culminated into the idea of what DevOps is. But DevOps, people continue to talk about DevOps maybe being outdated because it's already 13 years old as an idea, and that when DevOps was created, the idea, we barely had the cloud. We didn't have containers. We had a lot of concepts that we use today all day long that weren't necessarily applicable. So I think the future holds for maybe a new word that we haven't come up with yet on what is the future of DevOps and what's the next thing after DevOps. But really, it's just continuation on the same idea of deliver faster, deliver with higher quality, and everybody works together to collaborate on the DevOps lifecycle. It's not like DevOps does something that nothing else does and that we have to have it forever. So hopefully that helps. Do I see companies ditching Docker Desktop to other tools for local development because of the recent changes? Almost always no. Because unless you have a ton of free time and spare people to manage a solution like that, I have had 0 companies reach out to me and 0 clients change. So I haven't seen it happen at all. And I'm in the Docker Captain community, so we've all been talking about this. And what we are seeing is that it's actually causing companies to realize the value of Docker Desktop and then buy it more than just give it up. Because usually it's very entrenched, right? It's on every machine, and they realize that $5 a month per developer isn't that big of an expense, and in terms of keeping their developer workflow easy and happy, right? The alternatives, we'll have to wait and see. I think maybe if you look ahead a couple of years and we've seen things like Nerd Control and Lima and some of these ideas around a totally open source version of Docker Desktop, we might see something that is comparable, but right now there isn't. Like, that solution is very, very much a choose your own adventure path. And I'm not knocking them. These are all great ideas. I think that Docker deserves to charge for the software. I think we got a great 5 years of free use of that piece of software. And I think that open source alternatives will continue to mature and be better. But right now, I don't see that. I see everybody just buying it. And I think that Docker, hopefully, will have a successful business model now, because we all want Docker to continue to exist. We want the company to be profitable. We want them to stay around and keep making good software. In order to do that, they're going to need paying customers. And the feedback we're hearing especially on the blog, they're talking about it a lot on their blog, is that it's working. This is a successful path to helping people understand the complexity of getting Docker on all your machines and making it work perfectly with VPNs and all the different ways that you can run it, and that Docker Desktop has a value, and the Docker subscription is worth it. So I think it's working for people, and it's being a successful idea. It's become a successful endeavor, I think, for Docker to do this. Anyway, so let me know if you've tried the alternatives, if you've tried other ways of developing. What do you like? What do you not like? For me, I just go ahead and pay the $5 a month because I teach it, but it's easy. It works. There's lots of other things I get far less benefit from that I pay for, and I use Docker every day, so it makes sense to me. Great question. I want to get rid of manual tagging and uploading release zips to GitHub repos. Is GitHub Actions the way forward? Yes, it is the way forward. I do not have an example. If you go, I'm sure that this is well documented, but if you go and look up GitHub release, GitHub Actions, there are probably already existing actions that will help you automate your releases. And GitHub themselves they're improving. Like, right, I think they just announced at GitHub Universe that there's an auto. You can now automatically add all of your issues in a release based on the PRs that you did. So they're improving that as well. You definitely don't need to do it manually. I would say GitHub Actions is the way to do that. To be DevOps, do I master the details of Bash? No, I don't have the master details of Bash. And I've been doing Bash for 20 plus years. So I do not believe you need to be a master of Bash. I think you need to be able to read it, and you need to be able to troubleshoot like some basics and understand some of the basics. But other than that, that's why we have Stack Overflow, right? We have Stack Overflow to help us fill the gaps of our knowledge. But I think it is, if you were going to invest in a programming language, I suggest two. One is Bash. Bash scripting and basically learning the command line is a language in my mind, because there's lots of things and that you can automate there. And when you get a fancy Bash script, it looks like a programming language. The second thing is just pick another language. Python's probably the most popular. I like Node.js and Go, but pick one of those languages, one of those three probably: Python, Go, or Node.js, which I think are what I see are the three most common DevOps languages for automating things. But definitely no Bash as a part of that. Enrique, more questions. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed one. For a small cluster, about 10 servers on-prem, what Kubernetes distribution would you recommend? Probably Rancher. If you don't, I'm assuming you're talking about open source. Rancher first. RKE is the way to install Rancher, so RKE plus Rancher. Micro-K8s is also another good option. I'm not sure I would use K3s. I mean, K3s is fine, but there's a little bit more hand-holding with it. It doesn't come with a built-in GUI that I'm aware of, like Rancher. Although Rancher can run on top of it, now that I think about it. I don't have a major motivation around K3s or keys, depending on however you want to say it, keys for on-prem production, because I'm not looking to save that little bit of resources that it saves you, right? Usually if you're talking about a 10 server cluster, you don't have to worry about the 300 meg or whatever that it's going to save you. So I would go with something more popular. Probably Rancher and RKE by far are more popular than Micro-K8s and keys in terms of on-prem infrastructure. Like, I always try to go with the more popular ones, because if you're doing open source, if you're not buying support, I would recommend you go to Rancher and buy a support package, get their help. But if you don't have that money, then you're going to be doing it yourself, which means I would always default to the more popular one, because you're going to be leaning on open source communities and the internet for your troubleshooting and your help, right? So when you do that, you don't want a distribution that's not used by lots and lots and lots of people. I would probably compare Rancher and RKE to doing something like a kubeadmin for sort of vanilla upstream, and try both and see. I don't normally recommend vanilla, but at least you'll get a sense for what value Rancher adds to your setup. And you can always change, right? Rancher's open source. You can always change to a different distribution later. Thanks, Beth. I will consider a GitHub Actions course. It's on my list. It's like just a matter of which one I do first, like a DevOps Essential or a GitHub Actions. Could I do both? I still need to add more stuff to Kubernetes Mastery. I want to make that course better. So I've got to work on that as well. Yeah, Martin's throwing out some other ones. Tanzu, OpenShift. Tanzu's another viable option. I have not used it in a real world scenario, so I don't have a lot of opinion there. OpenShift is its own thing. So people that need to do OpenShift know they need to do OpenShift. I don't normally recommend it to people because it's almost like a special niche of distributions. And in my experience, OpenShift people tend to have support contracts with Red Hat, and they lean on those contracts. So it's maybe not the best open source way to do Kubernetes. What Docker alternatives to look at? That's a great question, but I would have to ask, what are you trying to do? Because Docker runs in lots of places in lots of ways. So an alternative to what? Your local machine? A Docker alternative might be Lima plus nerd control. So you probably have heard about those on this show. I've talked about those. If you go back in the archives of this channel, I have a whole video about Docker alternatives when we did the Docker show in September about all the changes to Docker Desktop. So just go look for a video called Docker Desktop Paid, and I talk about those there. If I've been able to run something like GitLab on Mac Mini, Mac M1 rather. I don't know, Lewis. I haven't tried. If someone out there has an M1 or an ARM machine, I don't know if they have an ARM build. So good question. Is there compatibility issues on M1 with Docker? Not really. I just showed off, unless you just got here, I just showed off a way to run Intel containers on ARM. They will run slower. So there's that, but also the machine's faster. So it kind of maybe in some ways equals itself out. The other thing I'd say is like there are specific images that don't work well or at all, but they're rare and there's usually an alternative. So MySQL can be problematic because they don't make an ARM version, but MariaDB is a great, I think, better alternative of MySQL that is basically MySQL that runs on ARM and on Intel and has other features. So you just do that, right? But most of the tools I use have an ARM variant anyway. So I'm setting up my new M1 today. Is Docker Mastery course updated for the M1? Yes. There are still some edge cases and a few of the videos still have issues, but feel free to point those out. Let me know. Actually, we are tracking a few issues over on the project board, and I probably should have a field just specifically for M1 stuff. But there are progress, like Postgres 9x does not have a ARM supported image, but the newest Postgres do. So one of the things we have to do is upgrade the video to specify a different version of Postgres, which we have not done. But you will probably figure that out very quickly in the course. And there are some places in the course where we indicate that. So yeah, I'd say 98% of it works just fine. But I think that's one of the few remaining bugs. Oh, and there's another one here. Yeah. So there's an example at the beginning of the course around building a Docker file with Nginx, and it doesn't specifically build on ARM, but a workaround, I need to probably add this in there. A workaround could be building with platform, Linux, AMD 64. So anyway, I probably Could add that in there and add that in the course just as a workaround until we get that particular lecture fixed. And then we have to re-record the video often. So that's what takes a lot of time, is getting the video re-recorded and edited and posted. But the whole goal of the course was to be M1 ready by the summer. And then it was, and then we found these 2 remaining issues that we along the way. So yeah, thanks for the likes. 16 likes. I appreciate it. Like this video if you want to see more of these Q&As, because I do them about once every month or every 2 months, but happy to do them more often if people want them. War file deployed from Docker and pushed to ACR, restarts app service. How do we check war working or not? Well, I would run it on your local machine. Does it work on your local machine? Then, then maybe if it doesn't work on your local machine, you can troubleshoot it locally. I would look at the exit code. When you do a Docker inspect and the container name, you can see the exit code, and if there's error messages, you can use the Docker logs command to see if it started, did the app have a problem and it spit out some logs? The logs will be empty if you couldn't even start the container. So you got to figure out, is it the app that's crashing, or is it the container itself that won't even start? That's like your first step. And you can use the logs and the inspect commands to help with that. So that's your first step. Sometimes the parameter is passed to NuGet, but sometimes it is dropped. Any idea why or how to make it consistent? I do not use NuGet, so I'm not going to be helped there, Biker. Maybe someone else in chat has used NuGet in Docker and has some tips. I just passed out my college in electronics and started a career in full stack developer. Can you suggest how I can grow my career? Well, I am not a full stack developer full time, so I'm not sure I'm the best one to ask there. This is more of a DevOps focused channel, so there's probably better videos on YouTube for that. If you have a more specific question, because obviously there's dozens of technologies you need to know. But always, from my point of view, I'm an operator, right? I come from a sysadmin background, so my opinion would be learn more networking and system fundamentals. You should know Linux better, networking better, distributed computing. Those are important concepts. Distributed architecture is something I'm constantly trying to help developers improve, because you might know a language well, but if you don't know how to put the pieces of the puzzle together and how to architect the different parts of your app in containers, then you're already behind, right? Like the people today that are developing on modern distributed architecture, they know things like 12-factor, which I mention a lot here. I'll just pull up that website, 12factor.net. Learn that and know that well, and know what each one of these means. This is a over 10-year-old concept that people still struggle with. So all of these things still hold true. There are 12 factors to making a modern distributed solution. It doesn't mean microservices. It just means your app is running in some sort of distributed architecture. And almost all apps today are running on servers in a distributed architecture. Your database, your website, and your API typically don't sit on the same server anymore, which means you have to know networking. You have to know TCP routing, IPs, how do IPs work, how do packets work, how does the Linux fundamentals work, what's the basics of Linux kernels and syscalls and Linux command lines. I expect developers now to know all that stuff, because they're developing solutions on those platforms, and then the minute their app doesn't work, they don't know how to troubleshoot. So then they have to lean on someone else who's a systems person who happens to know development and systems. So I think as a developer, obviously learn your languages, learn your frameworks, learn your tools for development. But the way you can be more useful to your team is to start understanding more of the DevOps side of things, right? So learning the DevOps concepts. And you can learn all that. I have some recommendations over at bret.show/DevOps. And so that may not work. Let me put that link in. And then security first. So I always think that you can know more about security. So Bret.show/security first would also be, those links are going to give you a list of recommendations. So those are common questions I get. So go check out the DevOps one, check out the security first one, those, and the 12 factor. Those are all common things I get questions on. To me, 12 factor is a prerequisite to understanding DevOps. Because once you've understood why DevOps needs to exist, then you need to understand how to implement it. And there's a mindset to it. And one of the things you need to know is, how do I architect a solution to work properly in the cloud, in containers, in a distributed environment? And there's a couple things you do. You learn 12 factor like it's like it's the back of your hand. Know it well. And then the next thing I would probably do is look up an O'Reilly book. Distributed systems. So Designing Distributed Systems is a good book that I recommend that everyone read. Paradigms for Scalable, Reliable Services. So look up O'Reilly Designing Distributed Systems. And then look up the Google SRE book. Now, this is specifically more in the realm of production and DevOps. So let's see if we can find right here. So Google has a site where they recommend, SRE basically is one of the job roles in the world of DevOps and operations. It's a little bit different than a typical DevOps engineer, which is why they've labeled it SRE, Systems Reliability Engineering. I think is the correct definition for that. So I would go learn those, and they have a list of books. All of these, to me, are fundamental to DevOps today. Once you've understood the basic concepts and you know a few of the tools, then you want to deepen your knowledge. I could not write better books than these books right here. I have not read these two. I've read part of the Building Secure and Reliable Systems book. All of these, by the way, you can read online, and that plus the distributed systems architecture, as well as any good Kubernetes or Docker book from O'Reilly. I would recommend those. All right. Let's get back to some of the questions. Let's see. Custom FLIW architecture. I don't know anything about that. Sorry, Anton. When creating multi-service containers like PHP, Docker good defaults, everyone seems to run supervisor as root, including examples on Docker docs. Is running supervisor as root in a container okay? Yes. It runs as root on a regular Linux system. Running it in there is okay. I would argue, though, that the pattern of combining both of these things into a single container, though, is a little outdated. You have to do that if you're just running Docker or Swarm, but in Kubernetes, you now run pods, and pods will have multiple containers, and in each pod, you can have a PHP and, like you can have the PHP server and the Nginx in front of it, and there are two different containers in the same pod. So I would recommend that rather than combining them nowadays, unless you're not running Kubernetes. If you're running it somewhere else where you can only run the one container, then you can combine them and use supervisor. But yeah, supervisor is fine as root. There are many applications that run as root in a container, but what they do, for example, Apache, Nginx, MySQL, these are all things that run as root, but they spin off workers that receive the connections, and the workers are not running as root. And that's how it keeps it more secure, is that they would have to access through the main worker applications, the binaries that are running in the background as daemons, and then if they would have to hack through that and then get to the other parent service to get into root, and then they're still locked into a container anyway. So Not a huge risk there. All right, another question here. Following the path of least resistance in the beginning, we think about mounting app codes not to bake them into containers. We'll use Compose to spin up our containers. Would this be okay for production? No, I am not a fan of that. I think that is an anti-pattern, and I don't blame you for thinking it because it seems simpler at first. Oh, we'll just ship our app code and leave the container running, but we'll change the code. The whole purpose of containers is to be able to be sure that the same thing running on your machine is the same thing running in production. And the problem that you create when you're replacing code on the fly in like a volume or a mount point, what you're doing now is now what happens is you're splitting out your application code from its dependencies. And we don't want to do that. We want our application code to ship with the exact dependencies that it was tested with and built with, right? And that it was developed with. So we want all those together. It may seem inefficient for you to ship a new image each time to update your code, but trust me, that's the model you want to follow. You're going to be able to get a lot of efficiencies and a lot more guarantees on this works everywhere, the same way as it works on my machine. That's going to work way better when you're shipping the image and the application dependencies all in one package. That's one of the magics that Docker invented, was saying we're going to bind these together, build them together, and then guarantee that they're always the same every time we run them. And when you split those things out, you now get into the old problems that we had before containers, which is which application version is really running on my machine? How do I roll back? How do I roll forward? Like all those problems you now have to solve yourself, where Docker had already solved those for you. But so you don't want to go backwards. You want to go forwards, shipping your application with its dependencies. Hope that makes sense. And that's a great question. I get that question a lot, by the way, in my courses. So it's a great question. Nothing wrong with having that, but I don't recommend it. Where to start? A simple roadmap to DevOps. Well, I just covered that, so hopefully you were here when I mentioned it. Bret.show/DevOps. Go check that out. Do I recommend Docker Swarm on production for small businesses? I would if you were a single person and you had small scale, you weren't dealing with hundreds of containers, and you didn't have a need to do Kubernetes. I honestly think that everyone will eventually become Kubernetes. Like that's the path forward. So you might use Docker, then Compose, then Swarm, and then eventually go to Kubernetes. You might just skip Docker Swarm and go straight to Kubernetes. I don't see very many companies implementing Docker Swarm in production for business that needs to make money on those systems. It's not because Docker Swarm isn't great. It's because the ecosystem is no longer making a bunch of tooling for Docker Swarm. So with Kubernetes, there's all these logging tools. We have multiple options for logging, for ingress. We have all these different things for storage, right? So there's tons and tons, hundreds, if not thousands, of projects to help you run Kubernetes and to give you the extra features you need in production. Unfortunately, Swarm doesn't have that community. So you kind of just get what you get out of the box. And then maybe you can add Portainer. You can use traffic as your ingress. But after that, there's not a lot out there. There's not a lot of community and growth. And so it's not so much that the tool itself isn't good, it's that the community has kind of moved on. And there's still some of us that still love it, but not enough to justify spending a bunch of effort to implement big Swarm clusters for real business stuff. So eventually what I will be doing in my courses is maybe for a while I'll still teach Swarm in my Docker Mastery course, but I'll sort of give you the basics and say, look, you probably want to just move to Kubernetes now because eventually there's lots of things to consider. One of them is when you're hiring your staff, they may not know Swarm, but DevOps staff today, DevOps staff are kind of expected to know Kubernetes. It's one of the defaults. No Docker, no Kubernetes, no one of the clouds. That's like the basics of DevOps nowadays. So you may have a challenge finding people that are experts in Swarm, right? Because they're now all focused on Kubernetes. So again, it's an ecosystem problem, not so much the application itself. Great question. By Node.js, you mean JavaScript, right? Since Node.js isn't a language. Correct. Node.js is a framework, obviously, but it is such a community that writing in Node.js to me isn't the same as just writing JavaScript, right? Because the patterns and the practices for writing quick little JavaScript utilities for Node.js are a little bit different with NPM and all the backend tools we get versus front-end JavaScript. So I do, when I say Node.js, obviously I mean JavaScript, but that is to me an easy automation language for backend, right? I was doing that 10 years ago. So writing Node.js is how I call it. But yeah, technically it's, it might be TypeScript, might not be JavaScript at all. Thanks for liking my courses. I really appreciate it. Come back and visit us. How can I use my Selenium script via Docker? I'm not sure. So Selenium is a container, and you can spin up those containers, and those containers can talk to your app that's in another container, right? So you don't want Selenium in your app container. You want them as separate, and you want Selenium to talk to your container and do the testing and stuff that it needs to do against your application container. I hope that helps. What tools am I using to prepare or record videos for my courses? I have a whole bunch of tools. The one that I use various tools to record depending on whether I'm at my desk or maybe I'm doing something in a different scene, or whether I'm doing a screen share or I'm just talking. I use ScreenFlow. I use Final Cut Pro. I use something called Descript, which is a pretty neat tool. I'm using this tool, Ecamm Live, sometimes. I also use another tool called MMHMM, and that is an interesting new tool for recording lectures. So yeah, I'm trying that out. But I kind of just use the default tools, like the tools that you see most people using. But yeah, I'm happy to answer any of those questions. Is it not a good approach to use SQL databases such as SQL Server in Docker in production? What are the disadvantages? No, I always recommend that. The reality is step one is if you're in the cloud, use the cloud databases. Don't run your own. Like, I get it for testing and development. That's fine. But don't run your own databases in production. It's too much work. You have to monitor it, and you have to make sure that it fails over correctly and that there's proper backups and that you know how to recover those backups. That's a lot of stuff. So just use the cloud. All right? That's step one. If you're not able to use the cloud for some reason, and I highly recommend that you use them, but if you're on-prem or somewhere, then I would look at Helm charts for things like Postgres so that you can set up clusters. There's a Redis chart, there's a Postgres chart. You can find those Helm charts, and then that will make sure that you're redundant, that it's at least mostly secure out of the box by default, that it has all the good secure defaults. And then there's nothing wrong with it. There's really no downsides there, other than that you have to run it yourself. The database performance is just as performant as running it outside Docker. So yeah, I don't see. I've been running production databases for 5+ years, so I don't see any reason to avoid it. I just don't like doing it myself. Do I have any experiences with Rancher? Yes. I mean, Rancher is probably one of the, if not the most popular open source distribution of Kubernetes, right? There's the vanilla upstream, which is just installing something with kubadmin. I don't really consider that a distribution, but a third-party distribution, Rancher is one of the most popular for sure. So yeah, I have experience with that. Roadmap to becoming a DevOps. What are the fundamentals? All right, so we've already talked about all that, Kendrick. Just go back and watch the video. I did a Bret.show/DevOps link. I've sent that in the chat if you scroll up. Oh, there it is right there. Where can we learn DevOps? Is there a way to dump all networking traffic going in and out of a specific Docker container without having root permission inside the container? For containers with root access inside, I've used TCP dump. Without having root permission inside the container. No. So in order to see all the packets on a NIC, I'm pretty sure you need root. Pretty sure. So I can't guarantee that, but I think that's a Linux fundamental of that. If you want to basically, TCP dump packets, you probably need to be root. I'm not an expert in whether you need root or not. I always have root because when I'm troubleshooting, I'm usually on a server or in a container that I have root. So and that's not a question that I'm certain on the answer. So if someone else in chat has that. Nigel Poulton's book on Docker and Kubernetes are excellent. Yes, Alexandra. Nigel has been on the show earlier this year. He has great books, and he updates them often. So I recommend those. What was the first book you said? Can you paste, please, the reference? Distributed Systems Design, I think, was the first one I suggested. Let's see. Yeah, I'll put this one in there. Someone may have already answered that question. A lot of these books you can find free copies of them or free excerpts on the internet. What are the pre-fundamentals if you're a support guy? Again, Linux, cloud, networking. Those are the three pillars of modern every job, even remotely related to DevOps, operations, development. To me, you should all understand Linux command line tools, some of the basics. You should all understand how a Linux system works. How do I look at mounts, drive mounts, disk mounts? How do I look at networking? How do I see Ethernet interfaces? How do I do things like TCP dump? And then understanding IP fundamentals, routing, switching, what's the difference, common ports, what are TCP ports, what is the difference between TCP and UDP, what's the difference between a switch and a hub, what's the difference between a router and a switch. Like those are all fundamentals. We should all know those by heart. How does a firewall work? How does a reverse proxy work? How does a forward proxy work? These are all things that I learned back in the 90s. With something called TCP Unleashed, which was a book which is probably still around. TCP Unleashed, TCP IP Unleashed, I think. And those fundamentals, along with me going and getting a Cisco CCNA certification, those are fundamentals that have served me in every job ever since from 30 years ago. So I highly recommend the networking and system fundamentals. Understanding hardware is key. Understanding the difference between a disk and memory, right? Understanding how those things work together. And then learning a cloud, just like learning the cloud basics of Amazon or Azure or Google, just one of them to start with. Those I expect anyone who's going to come in for a job on any team I would ever work with, I'm going to quiz them on those things because you can't be a developer for a distributed system if you don't understand networking. And if you're doing Linux development, you need to understand Linux fundamentals, how memory management works, what is out of memory errors, right? What happens when a disk gets full, how to do log rotation. Like these are all things that a developer will eventually learn because they're going to break it. Because if they don't consider it when they're developing, then they're going to have problems and later they're going to break stuff and then they're going to have to fix it. So yeah, those are all great questions. I really appreciate these questions. Is it possible to run multiple custom services inside a single container in system control format like when we don't need one custom service, we can stop other services running? You can. I really, really don't recommend it, though. The thing that containers did for us was it helped us isolate one application and its dependencies from another application and its dependencies. The minute you combine them together, you're inherently adding lots of complexity, and now you've tied these two applications at the hip so that they are always going to be together. And you may need to scale one. You may need to have 5 of one of them and 2 of the other. So how do you do that, right? When they're all in one container together. So I really recommend that you focus on one app, one container. Doesn't mean you can't. It just, in every case, I really strongly advise that you don't do that unless it's absolute that you can't avoid it. You can totally use system control in a container. I used Supervisor in my examples in GitHub. I have a GitHub example on Supervisor with PHP. Just go look up in my GitHub. Just go look up PHP. There's a repo called PHP. If you know more about the 12-factor apps, then there's a book called Beyond the 12-Factor App written by Kevin Hoffman. Yes, exactly. Thank you so much for that, Martin. And then there's also look up Look up the DevOps Handbook. That's another fundamental book, DevOps Handbook. That is, to me, like the basics of any DevOps job. Yes, that's also a great recommendation. You can probably find PDFs. Laravel in Docker, containers in production. Should I run Nginx and PHP in one container? So we just talked about that several times. So hopefully that answers your question. If you have more questions on that, please ask again. But I think the answer is, if you're in Kubernetes, no. Run them in separate containers inside a pod. If you're only running Docker, Docker doesn't understand pods. So Docker has to, either you have to run them together. The whole goal with things like that, with PHP and Nginx, is you want to run them on the same system together, because you don't want them to have to send traffic over TCP to another server as it comes in Nginx and then goes over to PHP and back. Ideally, you want them on the same machine so that the latency is zero, essentially. You want them, and that's what a pod does. A Kubernetes pod guarantees that those containers all run together on the same IP on the same host, right? So they get to share localhost, so they can see each other through localhost. They can share bind mounts, and they share all the other resources inside that pod. So that's what I try to do in production. You can combine them with something like Supervisor into the same container image, but that's, to me, a little old school. I try not to do that anymore, unless I can't avoid it. How do we back up the data in volumes in a container? A couple of ways. If it's just, like you playing around with tools, I have an example repo, something called Backup. Yeah. Why it's showing me Twitter before it's showing me my GitHub repo, I don't know. But I have a GitHub repo called Docker Backup that is an easy way for you to take a Docker volume and turn it into an image, and then you can put that image in a registry, or you can export the image, or do whatever you want. So you can do that. But really, in production, you're going to probably use either the cloud's backups of your Kubernetes cluster or a Kubernetes add-on called Valero. It's one of the popular projects for backing up your resources in Kubernetes, and it will create. It does all the things like, not just backups, but restores, and backing up all of your resources and objects inside of Kubernetes, not just your volumes. So check that tool out as well. I'll put that one in chat. And there is, yes, a second edition of the DevOps Handbook, which is the one that I'm lucky to have, I think. Or is that the one that's about to be released? I can't remember. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Yeah, that's the one I have. And you can get it on audiobook, which I also have. It's an audiobook, so you can just listen to it when you're doing the dishes or whatever. Oh, its second edition just came out? Hot dog. That is awesome. And that's literally... No, it's not out yet. Sorry. That's 2 weeks from now. I can't read it. So for those that are interested, look up the second edition. Sorry, I was confused. It's the one being released. I had a feeling. I was like, I feel like this thing is pending and it's not released yet. But yeah, it's releasing in a couple of weeks. So it'll be interesting to see what they've updated. Man, it would actually be great. Okay, this is a goal for 2021. I'm going to try to get one of the authors of that book on the show, and we can talk about what's in the second edition. I just had that idea. We're going to try that. I'm going to try to see if I can get either Gene Kim, that would be amazing, or Jez Humble, or Patrick, some of the original ones, John Willis. Yeah, that'd be awesome. All right. All right. Thank you all so much for being here. We're almost at an hour and a half long, and I'm starting to lose my voice. I can feel it getting a little raspy. So I'm going to wrap this up. So just real quick, any last questions you want to get in, last minute questions, go ahead. While you're typing those in, let me just cover some logistics. Next week is Thanksgiving in America, so I will not be having a show. But in 2 weeks, we will be back with Honeycomb. I'm going to have Liz Fong Jones from Honeycomb. Very excited to have them on. And we're going to talk all about Honeycomb, which is an observability platform, basically monitoring, that people are talking a lot about lately these last couple of years. So we will have them on the show. Then the week after that, in December, we're going to have test containers on with Sergey. And we're going to talk about what test containers are and talk about maybe some Java stuff, maybe some of the other test containers like Python. I think they have possibly one for PHP as well. And then we're going to have a Best in Tech 2021 show with my returning guests. We're going to have Laura Taco, Nirmal, Meta, and Ivor Cummings all on the show. And we're maybe some other special guests. I don't know if we can get more people on, but we're going to have a whole panel of people, and we're going to talk about our favorite tech in 2021. That is going to be on December 16th. So definitely show up for that. And then we've got more shows coming in January. We're already planning Cycle.io as another DevOps talk coming on the show in January, and some other guests that are being planned right now. So for the holidays, since you asked, next week is my 20th anniversary. So I'm going to be traveling to Washington, D.C. with my wife, and we're going to have some fun up there for our anniversary. I can't believe 20 years. So long ago. And then after that, in December, I'm actually going to be traveling to see my family in the middle of Missouri, in the middle of America. And I'll be doing the show from there. So you will see me doing a show like I did last year. I think it was, earlier this year, I did some shows from there. So we'll be doing shows on the road as I do. And then I will be having Christmas with the family. So with my parents and my brother. And I hope you all have a great holiday. So I won't see you Thanksgiving next week for you Americans that celebrate that. So happy Thanksgiving. For the rest of you, just go eat a bunch of food and you'll feel and then hang around with your friends and watch some sports. And that's basically what we do here in America. And that's all I got. Oh, Charlie, what are you saying here? A nice thing about the audio version of Nigel's books is that he modifies the text he reads to sound better as audio. Oh, really? Well, that's nice. Not just reading the code out loud. That's cool. Yeah, I've actually listened to his audiobook. I should just buy it to see what it's like. That would be fun. So thanks again for everyone showing up. We will see you again in 2 weeks. 2 weeks from now, we'll be back, and we will have special guest Liz Fong Jones from Honeycomb talking all about monitoring and observability. See you on the internets. Bye.